In 1815, after weeks of crossing the Sahara, Captain James Riley had finally reached a settlement, only to face starvation, enslavement, and near death in the desert. Riley was desperate to save what was left of his crew. In his trembling hand, he held a scrap of paper. The ink was uneven, written from a desperate and shaking hand, and the note said, "There are men dying behind me. If you can pay, they will live. If you cannot, they will be gone before the next moon." That note was more than a message. It was the last lifeline Riley had, one that was a gamble to save lives before time ran out. How had an American sea captain found himself driven to the edge of death in the deadliest parts of Africa? Well, stay with me, because this is the story of a shipwreck, a brutal march across the desert, and men pushed to the absolute edge of survival. This is the story of the Commerce and Captain James Riley. So let's get into it. Captain James Riley was a Connecticut-born mariner, a man who had earned his command through grit and decades at sea. He'd weathered the War of 1812, trading cannon smoke for the quieter but no less dangerous work of merchant shipping. At home, he had a wife and children and was said to have been facing financial difficulty. And the only way he knew he could provide for them was by earning his pay voyage by voyage. And in August of 1815, Riley took command of the American brig, the Commerce. It was a two-masted vessel bound from Gibraltar to Cape Verde Islands. The ship was small but sturdy, and she was meant to carry trade goods and only about a dozen men. They sailed with clear skies and routine orders, moving south along the treacherous coast of Africa, a route that promised profit, but carried a more dangerous reputation. To the men of the sea, Cape Boador was more than a point on a chart. Its name was spoken with caution. It was said to be a sailor's graveyard where currents, hidden reefs, and the hostility of those on shore had claimed countless ships. And Riley and every man on board knew the dangers they faced. But despite that, the Commerce pressed on, her white sails chasing the trade winds towards the waters where one mistake could mean disaster. It was August 28, 1815. Fog erased the horizon when the crew of the Commerce felt her keel lift. Then, they heard a grind. A hidden reef had caught her and held her fast. The shock threw the men against the rails, and all 12 crew members snapped to their stations as the hull began to creak and groan. The first wave breakers smashed over the deck. Riley's voice cut through the chaos and told the men to get on the pumps and start moving the cargo to the back of the boat to try and get her free. Then another wave hit and slammed the boat so hard the timbers began to break. The rigging tore loose and the seams in the sails split wide open. Water began to surge around their ankles and then to their knees. This is when Riley realizes there's no saving the vessel. Immediately they launched the longboat into the dangerous surf. There was literally rocks everywhere, so there was danger no matter what direction they went. It was said that they dug their oars into the water in a panic so hard that some of them literally snapped under the strain. A set of waves broke over the boat, hurtling them towards the beach. And as soon as they scramble out of the boat and get their bearings, they hear shouts rising from the sand dunes. Then, they see the spears. At this point, the attack seemed to be no surprise to the captain, who knew how dangerous these shores were to shipwrecked crews. The tribes along the coastal areas often attack any ships that neared their shore, claiming them for themselves. And in the rush and confusion, one of the seamen, Archibald Robbins, was struck down by a spear, which had caught him in the chest before his boots even found dry sand. The other saw the blood across his shirt, heard his cry, and watched him fall back into the surf and vanish forever. Suddenly, 2 more spears thudded into the sand near the boat, and the men scrambled desperately to push the boat back into the surf. At this point, the air was alive as they were shouting and the hiss of spears flying overhead. Somehow, they were able to get that boat launched and back into the surf away from the danger of the tribe. The men paddled back to the wreck to try and salvage what they could, but unfortunately their fresh water was gone. The water casks had been broken apart or had leaked and let seawater in, which was completely undrinkable. All the hardtack they brought with them had become nothing more than a soggy paste soaked in seawater. With every wave crashing against the shipwreck, it was taking more and more damage, and Riley knew they wouldn't be able to stay here long. He was able to get his bearings and grasp their true peril. They had wrecked on one of the most feared stretches of the African coast, where the Sahara runs into the sea. Here, there were no settlements, no rivers, no food, only the heat of the desert, empty shoreline, and tribes known to capture and enslave any survivor the sea delivered to them. For 3 days after the wreck, the longboat hugged the treacherous coast, the men scanning the barren shoreline for any sign of either fresh water or shelter. Each pull of the oars was slower than the last, and Riley weighed their dwindling strength against the choice no captain wanted: to stay adrift and die of thirst, or risk the shore and face whatever awaited there. A choice that would be that much harder in this situation because they've been attacked only 2 days earlier. I couldn't imagine how hard that choice would be. The area that they were in was the territory of the Ulad Busba, a nomadic Sahara tribe known to control caravan routes between the desert interior and the coast. They were fierce traders, often taking shipwrecked goods, and when the opportunity presented, taking the stranded human captives for ransom or sale. By the third day, Riley knew the Atlantic was no longer the option for them. They're going to attempt a landing well south of the wrecks, hoping to find a less hostile approach. Riley did his best to calculate their position, and unbelievably, they had actually rowed and drifted almost 300 miles south of the wreck site, and now they were near a stretch of coast called Cape Barbarous. Unfortunately for them, it didn't have any different of a reputation for its dangers on land and the tribes in the area. They were able to land their longboat near a strip of sand dunes. They dragged the boat above the tide line, hoping no one would notice it. And for a moment, the beach seemed empty. They breathed a sigh of relief, thinking they were finally safe. But then they saw a movement, and it was a line of riders cresting the dunes on camels, their white robes whipping in the wind and their curved swords flashing in the sunlight. The riders fanned out in a half circle, closing in with deliberate precision. It was almost like they had been followed from the wreck site. With weapons pointed at them, the men began to panic. Riley called out, but his English was swallowed by the wind. The riders answered in rapid Arabic, voices sharp and commanding, but no one understood what they were saying. The circle drew tighter, and 2 riders dismounted, gesturing with spears towards the crew to remove their clothing and hand over their bundles. When one sailor hesitated, the flat of a sword cracked hard against his shoulder. It was enough for them to comply, and within minutes, the Americans were stripped of what little they had left: no shirts, belts, knives, or even shoes. They were split up into smaller groups under armed guards. In a small moment of relief, one of the captors handed Riley a leather bag. It would be the first drink that he had had in days, but unfortunately for him, that bag was full of hot, sour camel milk. But it would do. The others received the same, and the only food they were given was some bitter desert roots and cracked date pits to quiet their hunger. They were given only enough to survive, but nothing more. Thanks for joining in, and I hope you're enjoying this episode a lot more than some hot and sour camel milk. And if you do, consider subscribing to the channel or sharing it with someone you know. With that, I'll move on. They thought they would be facing survival at the hands of the Saharan desert, but now it was completely in the hands of their captors. To ensure the men had less of a chance to escape once separated into small groups of 2 or 3 people, they were marched in different directions. None of them knew if they would see each other again. One of the crewmen with Riley, James Clark, was just a boy at only 16 years old. The size of Riley's group was about 5 people, but it was constantly shifting as other captives were added to the group or some sold. And they marched inland barefoot on sand that burned like iron under the midday sun. Every step opened blisters in their feet. The wind scoured their faces until the skin split and their lips bled. They were forced to march for days, becoming delirious and not even really understanding how long they had been marching. They were so dehydrated because the captors only gave them the smallest amount of liquid to drink, they ended up drinking their own urine to try and stay alive. But unfortunately, like in a lot of situations, it just ended up making them more dehydrated. Riley would later write,
"Day came on amidst these accumulated horrors. Thirst pressed upon us, which we could only allay by wetting our mouths twice a day with a few drops of wine and water, and as many times with our urine."
At this point, they really had no idea where they were going. They were just being forced to march forward one by one like cattle. Riley's best guess is that they weren't being taken to a tribal village, but somewhere else entirely. The truth was, These men were money on legs. To the captors, they were valuable property worth camels, goods, or coins. If they could ransom these guys quickly or sell them to a slave trader, they stood to make some money. For Riley and his crew, the choice to keep moving wasn't really a choice at all. Some of them were so delirious, they just kept staggering forward on instinct alone. And if one man in the group slowed too much, the butt of the spear was pushed into his back. Under this exhausting heat and duress, one of the men, George Williams, fell and never rose again. He was worn past the point of recovery and ended up collapsing in the sand, unable to answer to the blows or shouts from the captors. The tribe simply left him where he laid, and the heat and desert claimed him, and he was never seen again. Riley was watching his crew slowly fade away. Worried about their health, he even gave away scraps of his own ration just to try and keep them alive. Riley would later write about the torment of thirst, describing how his tongue had swelled until it filled his entire mouth, and his throat felt as if it had been scorched by fire. At night, the heat would recede, but unfortunately, the cold would find them. The men would burrow into the sand for warmth, their bodies trembling until the first light of dawn. It was during one of these marches that a new figure appeared. Sidi Hamet, a trader from the interior. He studied Riley for a long moment, then spoke with the other captors. Riley seized the chance. Through gestures and broken words, he made his offer. Buy us, and I will lead you to a rich friend in the city of Mogador, who will pay dearly for our freedom. It was the best Riley could come up with, but unfortunately for him and that crew, that friend didn't exist. It was just a desperate ploy to try to get them at least into a settlement or city somewhere so they might escape or maybe get a hold of somebody back in America. The city of Mogador is actually a small port city in Morocco, but at the time, it was a lifeline to the Atlantic, so these guys definitely knew it could be their best bet. Now, Sidi Hamet took Riley at his words, and after a brief exchange with the other captors, a trade was made, and Riley, along with a small group of his crew, passed into the trader's possession. For the first time since the wreck, they were moving towards the coast, though none of them knew exactly how far it laid. In reality, the march ahead would span 400 to 500 miles, a journey of weeks across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The desert stretched out in an unbroken haze, and the pace they took was relentless. It was endless days under a white-hot sky, which gave way to freezing nights that stole the warmth from their core. At times, sandstorms would roll in without warning, choking their lungs and scouring their skin and literally stopping them dead in their tracks. Riley paced the line as he marched, staying near the weakest, helping them along. One of the crewmen would later write in a memoir of the constant fear that if any man fell, they would be abandoned in the sand, left to the wind and sun, or the vultures. Somehow still, these men, gaunt, weak, nothing really left of them, managed to keep pushing forward, driven literally by desperation and the gamble that Riley had created. They marched non-stop for almost 6 weeks, covering hundreds of miles until they crested a sand dune which gave way to the Atlantic, a thin blue line shimmering on the horizon. The smell of salt drifted in the wind, and Riley knew they were finally close. Somewhere ahead of them laid Mogador, the city where he promised Sidi Hamet could get a healthy ransom for the crew and hopefully set them free. But if Sidi found out his bluff, for certain, all of the men would die. Riley begged Hamet for a chance to approach the gates alone. He told him his rich friend would only pay on the spot if given proof they were alive. Hamet hesitated. It was his property on the line. But time mattered. The captives were worn thin, and Hamet wanted his payment before they collapsed. In the shade of a crumbling wall, Riley found a scrap of paper. He begged Sidi for something to write with, and Sidi agreed. Riley's hand shook as he wrote the note, the ink blotting on the rough fibers. The note said, "There are men dying behind me. If you can pay, they will live. If you cannot, they will be gone before the next moon." Riley is also writing this note for the members of the crew that were split off from him earlier and marched under different masters. Some are still in the desert. He knew that if this note failed to work, not only would he likely die, but those who weren't sent to Mogador also would. Sidi Hamet gave the note to an interpreter who was able to bring it immediately to the British consulate, and the message reached William Wilshire, the British Vice Consul. He read the desperate lines and then mounted his horse without delay. Only hours later, he rode through the city gates, a foreigner risking his own fortune to redeem American strangers. When he saw Riley's condition, there was no more doubt, and payment was made immediately. For the first time since the reef tore the commerce apart, Captain James Riley was free. But the faces of those still in the desert stayed with him. And he knew this gamble worked for him, but he just prayed somehow that against all odds it would work for the others. Over the following weeks, Wilshire worked desperately to locate and ransom them, sending out trusted agents with camels, supplies, and golds. In the end, out of the original crew of 12, 10 returned alive. 2 had perished, one during their first violent landing, and another who collapsed under captivity, too far gone for rescue. Their loss was felt sharply among the survivors, and the empty spaces they left was very real to them. By the time the last man walked through Wilshire's door, Riley had traveled more than 500 miles on foot over 6 brutal weeks, crossing the Atlantic shore where the commerce had wrecked, into the desert's interior, and back again to the ocean at Mogador. Under Wilshire's roof, they began the slow work of mending their bodies. Feet were wrapped in linens, their wounds were salted and cleaned, and their bellies were finally reintroduced to real food. It took months before Riley actually regained enough strength to sail back to America, only arriving home in 1816. He set his ordeal to paper in a memoir titled Sufferings in Africa. It was a detailed narrative of his captivity and became one of the most widely read books of his time. The unflinching account of endurance and compassion across cultures would later be cited by Abraham Lincoln, the formative influence. I can't imagine what was going through Riley's head at the gates of Mogador, because he knew this was all a gamble right from the moment he met Sidi Hamat. Lucky for them and lucky for the others that were still out there in the desert, it worked, and these guys lived to sail another day. Survival isn't always completed through brute strength and conquering your environment. Sometimes it's the ability to risk everything and outsmart those around you. What an incredible story, and I can't wait to be back again with another one next week. I hope you liked it. See you then.